Good morning to the UK and good evening, Australia. A warm welcome to the Acting High Commissioner, Ms. Lynette Wood, Colleen Schooling from the CPA, our sponsors for today, our speakers and guests. I'm Joanne Holland, the CEO of the Australian UK Chamber of Commerce in London. And the Australia UK Chamber of Commerce is pleased to be partnering with the CPA Australia for this webinar today, with global thought leaders and economics professionals to assess the impact of the extreme crises on global economic markets. The world is facing several evolving challenges, with world economic markets riding the tidal wave of the fallout of these challenges, the COVID-19 pandemic, rising inflation and living costs, and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. These factors are having a significant impact on financial markets. Foreign currency and exchange rates, migration patterns across Europe, coupled with an escalating refugee crisis, and the increasing demands for greater corporate responsibility against a backdrop of the war in Ukraine. Today, our topic is economics during a time of global conflict, and we have 4 excellent speakers to address the many facets of this complex topic. Our excellent speakers today are Ms. Lynette Wood, Acting High Commissioner to the UK, Professor Theo Farrell from the University of Wollongong, James Hayton, a Special Counsel to LK Law, and John Swerringer, Minister Counsellor Treasury at the Australian High Commission in London. We're expecting a lively discussion, so please submit any questions that arise during the webinar into the Q&A function on Zoom. These will be addressed when we come to the Q&A session later. Now, to introduce our sponsors, the CPA, I welcome Ms. Colleen Schooling. She's the Regional Head, Europe and United Arab Emirates. Welcome, Colleen.
Thank you, Joanne. And yes, CPA Australia is certainly very pleased to partner with the Australia-UK Chamber on this webinar event today. And I also would like to acknowledge our Acting High Commissioner, Ms. Lynette Wood, joining us today, together with our esteemed panel of speakers. And I also extend my own welcome to all of our members and chamber members and guests who are with us today. It's a very big group from around the world. And I think that that certainly speaks to some keen interest in this particular topic. Global conflict and crises tragically have an immediate impact on those at the forefront and ultimately on economic factors, businesses and individuals. We all see the news and other media, of course, but these sorts of forums allow us an opportunity for another means of distilling and evaluating current and future impacts. So we very much appreciate our speakers giving of their time today and look forward to their insights and commentary. Just before we move to the discussion, I know that we have many of our members online today, but for those of you who are not overly familiar with CPA Australia, a brief introduction. With a 136-year history, CPA Australia has grown to become one of the largest accounting bodies in the world, with more than 170,000 members in over 100 countries and regions, all working in a wide range of industries and sectors. The CPA designation is recognised globally, and it represents financial, accounting and business advisory professionals of the highest training and expertise. The CPA program places great importance on technical knowledge. However, what sets our program and our members apart is also our focus on other professional skills, such as business strategic ability, strong influencing skills, and being a persuasive and adept communicator. In addition to the CPA program, CPA Australia is at the forefront when it comes to advocacy and public policy and debate, particularly across the Asia-Pacific region. And we're recognised internationally for specialist training in accounting and finance for business. With 20 offices around the world, including in London, We welcome any interest from those who may be considering the CPA program or who would like to know more about our bespoke training and development programs for finance and non-finance professionals as well. It's always a great pleasure working with Joanne and the team at the Chamber, who I have to say run a fantastic program of events throughout the year. And I certainly once again extend my thanks to the team for your collaboration on this event. And with that, I'll now hand back to Joanne and our speakers today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you to the CPA guests today. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker today, the new Acting High Commissioner, Ms. Lynette Wood. Ms. Wood was the former ambassador to Germany and has been appointed Acting High Commissioner to the UK. She's a senior career officer with DFAT and was most recently First Assistant Secretary Europe and Latin America Division, including the Ukraine Task Force. Prior to that, she was First Assistant Secretary Consular and Crisis Management Division and Australia's Ambassador to Germany, Switzerland and Liechtenstein from 2016 to 2020. Welcome, Ms. Wood.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening to everybody who's participating today in this webinar. Thank you very much for this excellent initiative. I think the timing is just right. We're about nearly 3 months into this terrible conflict with Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine and the consequences which have flowed out of that. And I think today provides an excellent opportunity for us to have a robust discussion about how we've responded to that aggressive action, but also what the economic ramifications are and the ways that we are going to have to factor in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine going forward. In the context, as you said in your introduction, of a backdrop of coming out of the 2 years of the pandemic and the consequences that that has already had on the global economy. I thought I must admit up front that I am not an economist, so I'm not going to dwell on economic analysis. I'm delighted that we're also joined today by John Swerringer, who's the Minister Councillor for Treasury here at the Australian High Commission. And I know that he'll be eminently qualified to provide a technical analysis. What I thought I would focus on is what Australia's response has been to the invasion of Ukraine. As Joe mentioned, prior to coming to London, I was leading our Ukraine task force. And there's a couple of points to make before I go into some specifics. What I think has been very impressive and in fact quite encouraging from an international diplomatic perspective is the coordinated response. At a time coming in, the last 2 years of the pandemic has been an exceptional time in global affairs. And there had been questions about the coherence of the West and of liberal democracies, some differences between all of us on various issues. But I think what's been very encouraging about the response to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine is seeing that when the chips are down, that we have all pulled together in a very unified and coordinated way, using a variety of tools. And as I was just saying to John before the webinar started, what has been particularly encouraging is the willingness of Western liberal democratic nations, and not only the West, I mean, the West can be taken in a much broader sense than Europeans. What's particularly encouraging is that countries are willing to accept a cost because of the principle that we're defending. When the principle of territorial sovereignty is one that should always have consequences and should not be broken. The international order since the end of World War II has been founded on the principle of territorial sovereignty. If you have internationally recognized borders, that's it, full stop. There's not a question of ongoing debate about where your borders are, or if you feel that you prefer to have a little bit of your neighbour's country, that it's acceptable to take that unilaterally. And I think that's the basis for the swift and unified international response to Russia's actions. So to run through in a general overview about what Australia has done in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have responded on a number of levels. First, I'd like to mention, of course, the Australian government's response supporting its own citizens who have been affected by the circumstances in Russia and Ukraine. Our consular team worked very quickly and very proactively to place teams not in Ukraine, but around its borders and in neighbouring countries to assist Australians who were fleeing the violence. And that was a substantial effort. The Australian government has also announced visa possibilities for Ukrainians to find pathways to Australia. To date, around 7,400 visas have been issued to Ukrainians in Ukraine, and of those, about 2,800 have since made their way to Australia. It's understandable that many of those will be staying in the neighbourhood and hoping that the conflict will be resolved in the short to medium term so they can return home. But we have issued them visas so they can move to Australia should they wish to do so. On the hard side, like many other countries, including the UK, and since we're sitting here in London, I also want to acknowledge the strong response and leadership by the United Kingdom to the events in Ukraine and its strong support, along with many other countries, to Ukraine. From Australia, the Australian government has pledged well over $220 million in military assistance to Ukraine. This has included lightweight howitzers, howitzer ammunition, over 20 Bushmaster protected mobility vehicles, and a range of other assistance, which is kept confidential for obvious reasons. Australia has also pledged well over $65 million in humanitarian assistance to meet the urgent needs of the Ukrainian people. We're working with trusted humanitarian partners, including in the UN and NGOs, to address immediate needs such as food, water, shelter, health, and protection. And I think we're all aware that the humanitarian dimension is serious and growing. Australia has also supported Ukraine's energy security by donating at least 70,000 tonnes of thermal coal and blocking exports of alumina to Russia, which has seen us power over 10 million Ukrainian homes and cut off one source of crucial energy supplies to Russia. The other two tools which I'd like to highlight are sanctions and the multilateral system. And this is where I think it is very impressive seeing the unity of the international system. So in the multilateral system, there was very quickly the conclusion that there must be costs for Russia for what it's done. And that must be at all levels and in many different fora. So in the multilateral system, we've worked with partners to exclude or isolate Russia so that it cannot simply be business as usual when international rules have been violated in the way they have been. So we have joined statements condemning Russia and its actions. We've supported in March 2 UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia's invasion. In April, we supported a resolution to suspend Russia from the United Nations Human Rights Council, and in a range of other areas we provided support, such as $1 million to the International Criminal Court to support its investigation into the situation in Ukraine. So I think it's important to see that a unified global response means acting in a range of fora. Finally, sanctions. I know there's often debate about whether sanctions are a useful or wise tool, and of course there are implications for all of us when we impose sanctions on another country. So far, Australia has listed over 812 individuals and 47 entities in Russia and Belarus for targeted financial sanctions and travel bans. We've also introduced other trade measures, such as we've banned the import of Russian oil, refined petroleum products, coal and gas. We've banned the export of alumina and bauxite to Russia, and we've banned the export of certain luxury goods to Russia, including wine and cosmetics. And in the multilateral trading system, we have denied Russia access to most favoured nation tariff treatment, which is imposing additional tariffs of 35% on goods produced by Russia or Belarus shipped to Australia, which are not captured by our bans. To put this in context, and going to my point about joining international consensus and imposing costs on Russia, before the conflict, Australia actually had not very substantial trade with either Russia or Ukraine. In 2021, our goods exports to Russia, for example, totaled only $655 million, or just 0.2% of Australia's exports. So it's not as if we have taken this proportionate to our trading situation or mindful of our trading situation. It's more a principle-based approach to impose costs on Russia. Finally, before I conclude, because I'd like to leave time for the other speakers and to make sure we have time for a robust discussion, on this sanctions side, I wanted to give you some example of who we've targeted. As you would expect, we have targeted Russian President Putin, his daughters, Foreign Minister Lavrov, his daughter, Defense Minister Shoigu, the Prime Minister, the Belarusian President and his family, all the permanent members of Russia's Security Council, and senators who voted at the very beginning of the conflict to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics, 110 Russian oligarchs and senior officials, 416 members of the Russian parliament, 22 Russian financial institutions, including the Central Bank of Russia, 4 Russian defense industry entities, 34 Russian army and military commanders, the armed forces of the Russian Federation, 32 persons with key roles in Russian disinformation, 25 figures in the Belarusian government, and 34 senior members of the Russian-led movements in Donetsk and Luhansk. And the point about this being a unified, coordinated, joined-up international effort is to mean that there are no gaps in the international system, so that the cost that we're imposing on Russia with the intent of halting the invasion and reversing its aims and intents in Ukraine is as effective as possible. So on that note, I will conclude, and thank you again very much for the invitation to join me today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wood, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you later. A very robust response from Australia. Thank you. I'm now going to introduce Professor Theo Farrell. He's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor responsible for innovation, excellence in education and student experience at the University of Wollongong. He joined the University of Wollongong in 2017 as an Executive Dean and was promoted to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor in 2019. He is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in the UK, Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in the UK, Fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales, Senior Associate Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute, and Visiting Professor in War Studies at King's College, London. Professor Farrell is Britain's leading expert on the war in Afghanistan. He acted as strategic advisor to the UK government and US-led command in Kabul and participated in Track 2 talks with the Taliban. Professor Farrell's research focuses on transformative change in the character of armed conflict, and he's held 10 UK Research Council Awards, including a prestigious 3-year Global Uncertainties Research Fellowship. His latest monograph, Unwinnable: Britain's War in Afghanistan, was shortlisted for 3 National Book Awards and selected Book of the Year by the Sunday Times. Welcome, Professor Theo Farrell.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and thank you to the Australian UK Chamber of Commerce for the invitation to speak this evening. And to everyone who's on this call, I'd just like to say hello from Darwall country in New South Wales, and I'd like to recognise and pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging. So just I thought I'd offer a few kind of comments to kind of recap on what's happened in the war in Ukraine, and then just in the brief time available, tease out 5 geostrategic implications. So just to remind everyone, the war started on the 28th of February. The Russians expected it to be over in a matter of days, and they weren't alone. I think most observers expected it to end quite quickly. Here we are 80 days on, and it looks like this war is not going to end anytime soon. Russia mobilized about 190,000 troops to conduct the war and committed well over 90 of its battalion tactical groups into the fight. Now, the Russian army is vast. You know, it's 1 million regular troops, it's 2 million reserves. So this doesn't sound like huge numbers in that context. But the key point to realize is that Russia committed its best military units and forces into the fight. An initial attempt by Russia, principally by air assault, to seize Kyiv failed. And so by failing, Russia failed to topple the Ukraine government. And then what we saw were 3 main lines of attack. A push down from the north, from Belarus and from Russia down north towards Kyiv, Russian forces breaking out from the east, from the Donbass region, and Russian forces quite successfully actually breaking out from the south in Crimea. But overall, and through very hard fighting, the Ukrainian self-defense forces have managed principally to defeat the Russians in the north and contain them in the east and the south. Russian army losses in this war have been absolutely staggering. Reasonable estimates put Russian losses at around about 28,000 troops. That's just an unbelievable figure. Russia appears to have lost about 1/3 of the battalion tactical groups that it committed to the fight. It's going to be extremely difficult for the Russian army to regenerate those forces. They've lost about 4,000 tanks and other armored vehicles, over 1,000 artillery pieces and air defense systems. Over 200 warplanes have been shot down. I just can't underestimate the extent to which these losses, it's inconceivable before the war, and yet this is what Russia has suffered. Principally, one of the reasons, principally part of what's happened here is that Ukrainian defense forces undertook very successful reforms after the invasion of Russia in 2014. And the US, UK, and Poland deployed training missions to support comprehensive reform of the Ukrainian defense forces. And the Ukrainians have been conducted military operations on the basis of these reforms, using the tactics that they've been taught by the UK, US, and the Polish military trainers. But most of all, this is a comprehensive failure of Russian strategy and tactical operations. So Russia's special operation, as it announced, what we've seen in this is, absolutely staggeringly bad strategy by Russia. I mean, in King's College London for a decade, I taught modern war studies. Basic first years could do a better strategy than the Kremlin conducted in Ukraine. And principally, one of the core principles of strategy is that you have a main effort. But what we saw in Russia's war in Ukraine is they tried to go for everything all at once. And so there was a diffusion of effort. That's a fundamental mistake in strategy. There was no attempt by the Kremlin to prepare the population and its own military for war. So there was no national mobilization in the initial phases of the war. And there were multiple accounts of Russian forces going into Ukraine thinking that they were conducting an exercise and not realizing that they were actually being committed to a war. And we saw appalling tactics by Russian troops, very poor logistics. All of these were ruthlessly exploited by the Ukrainians. The impact, of course, has been felt most profoundly on Ukraine itself and on the immense suffering that many people have suffered. Around about 25% of the entire Ukrainian population has been displaced from their homes. Half of those people, over 6 million people, have fled across international borders into neighboring countries, creating the worst refugee crisis that Europe has experienced since World War II. So this has been an absolutely monumental event. Now, what are the geostrategic implications? Well, briefly, there are 5 that I'd like to just tease out. First concerns the persistence of interstate conventional war. So there might be a temptation to say this is a black swan event. Who could have predicted it? Well, it was actually pretty well predicted in advance that there would be some large-scale Russian military action against Ukraine. But the point is rather that interstate conventional war has not disappeared from the world system. And we've seen a number of times where there have been very large interstate conventional wars. Think of 1990 to 1991 Gulf War. Think of the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. And now, of course, we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where, the scale of the war was so large, it had ramifications and ripple effects across the entire world stage. So, I mean, if I were in the business of international finance, I would be saying, okay, we always need to price in and prepare for large-scale interstate warfare. Second geostrategic implications concerns Russia as a malign actor. It was already evident from Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 that Putin's regime was going to cause problems. But what we've seen since then, and of course with the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, is growing realization in the West that Russia was not going to be, it was going to be difficult to get Russia to become a cooperative and productive partner in the world system. With what we've seen now, of course, with the latest invasion with a more comprehensive invasion of Ukraine, is some moves within Europe that really signal the extent to which the European countries now see Russia as a malign actor that must be contained. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that we are now in the midst of what is a new Cold War. And so we saw, for instance, a big shift in Germany's historic position with regards to its Pacific foreign policy. And so the German government has authorized the export of lethal weapons. Germany has created a massive fund to rearm its armed forces. Historically, we've seen Finland and Sweden commit to NATO membership and shifting off their decades-long position of neutrality. And also, equally important, we've seen within the United States its strategy shift from being one of just trying to contain the advance of the Russian armies and try and bring things to a ceasefire, to actually, it's been, the US have revealed that their principal strategy now is to attrit the Russian military to such an extent that its ability to conduct these kinds of aggressions in the future would be contained for some time. The third geostrategic implication concerns Western resolve. We saw that with the unity of EU response, principally with the sanctions, with the extent to which the European Union came together, and particularly in imposing the sanctions around banking and international finance transfers, was really quite remarkable. But also, this has been quite important in reviving NATO. NATO, before this latest Russian action, had stagnated, but now we've seen a comprehensive revival of NATO. The other people will talk about the international finance, but of course, the extent to which the international financial sanctions have really impacted on Russia, that has been quite material. But what I would point out also is the extent of arms supplies and training being provided by several Western countries. It was noted the United Kingdom, of course, Australia, but the United Kingdom has actually been very important in this respect. But also the United States. The United States has provided $3.8 billion in military aid to Ukraine. And now aid is getting to, the level of aid that's been provided is getting to such an extent that we're now facing the prospect that NATO is going to have to backfill its own military arsenals. So the Ukraine Democracy Land Lease Act that is being signed by the Biden administration and most likely will pass Congress will provide $11 billion, that's US dollars, in aid to Ukraine. That's a staggering sum. And at that level, the United States will be drawing down very comprehensively its own military arsenal, and will then have to, it's going to have to acquire more weapons to refill it. The fourth geostrategic implication concerns implications for Asian security. And in particular, a key question in this part of the world is, what lessons will China draw? Now, of course, the context here is a decades-long military modernization effort by the People's Republic of China and the PLA, and growing assertions by China in the region and its willingness to use the military instrument. One quick and obvious lesson is that invading a country is actually much more difficult than it might appear. And that has a very important consequence with respect to Chinese plans and ambitions towards Taiwan. An important lesson surely must be for any aspiring tyrant and dictator is, don't believe your own hype in terms of what the military tell you. A lot of these authoritarian regimes, they conduct military exercises where their militaries, these are very carefully staged, managed military exercises where the militaries appear to be incredibly efficient and high functioning. But actually, when it comes to war, well, war is an immensely chaotic activity. And what we've seen here is that the Russian army has grossly underperformed against what was expected by observing its previous military exercises. The one caveat I would put around this, of course, is that Putin, before this latest comprehensive invasion of Ukraine, Putin was seen as a pretty clever operator. He was seen as strategically pretty canny, but of course he overreached himself. What we're hearing now in terms of why this happened is that his growing isolation of Putin within his own government, a small cabal of advisors around Putin, and Putin being out of touch. And arguably, some of those characteristics also apply to Xi Jinping. So there'd have to be a caveat around the extent to which we can expect China to be a rational actor in drawing out lessons from Ukraine. The fifth and final geostrategic implication concerns Australian defence. And principally, I think the war in Ukraine just affirms the position that was taken in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update. This very important strategic update by the Australian Department of Defence, it points to the fact that Sino-US strategic competition will be the primary strategic driver in the Indo-Pacific. It said it was time now for Australia to put aside its traditional planning assumption of a 10-year strategic warning time of a major conventional attack. That now seems quite prudent. It committed a major program of investment in defence so that the Australian Defence Forces could be self-reliant, saying that Australia would spend 270 billion Australian dollars in the coming decade. It said that Australia would adopt a less risk-averse engagement with industry to deliver defence capability. And quite importantly, of course, Albanese has come out and said that if Labour is elected into government, there will be no reduction or deviation from this level of defence expenditure. The final comment I would note is that, of course, at the core of this huge investment in Australian defence is a real focus on major weapon platforms, and including, for instance, the future submarine. And there is a very large degree of risk around those. And in fact, notwithstanding what seems to be a strategic clarity in the part of the Department of Defence, it seems to be matched by a as of yet inability to deliver major platforms equipment on time, in budget, and to the capability that's expected. So those are the geostrategic implications. I'm going to hand back to Joanne now. Thank you.
Professor Theo Farrell, thank you so much. Huge amount of information to absorb, absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in relation to your topic on implications. Thank you. Our next speaker is James Hayton, who's Special Counsel at LK Law. It's an Australian firm with an office in London. And James has extensive experience with resolving disputes through commercial litigation and international arbitration across a variety of industries, including financial services, professional services, and the art world. James has been published in leading journals on topics of international arbitration and civil procedure. Welcome, James Hayton.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Thank you to the Australian UK Chamber for the invitation to speak today. And it's a pleasure to be on such a distinguished panel. Both previous speakers are hard acts to follow, but I'll do my best. As Joanne said, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to approach this from a legal perspective and talk about 3 points. The first one is sanctions, which you've heard a bit about already. And the other two are ways in which the law, both international law and I'm going to talk about English law. There are similarities, of course, with Australian law and other common law jurisdictions, how the law tries to do justice to private parties who are feeling the consequences of conflict. And I'm going to focus obviously mainly on businesses. So first of all, sanctions. We've already heard from Her Excellency, the Acting High Commissioner, and Professor Farrell about the immense growth of sanctions, the widening of scope of sanctions that has taken place and are imposed by not only America and the EU and the UK, but also Australia. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about what those are. Instead, I'm just going to say a few words about where I think those sanctions might be heading next. First of all, it would be a mistake to think that they're just limited to the provision of goods or commodities. And I think all of us, well, certainly the members of the CPA, if you're doing any business out of London, should be aware that the US and the UK certainly are going to soon impose bans on the provision of accountancy, as well as management consultancy and public relations services by any US and UK firms to Russians, not just Russians on the sanctions list, as I understand it, but any Russian businesses. So the amount of work being done from London anyway, and the US is probably already pretty small at this stage, but it's going to be wiped out entirely. Legal services will be exempted, and if you want to know more about that, you can perhaps ask in the Q&A. But there are some good reasons for that, although perhaps I would say that. There's no indication that sanctions are going to be extended, at least as far as the US and UK are concerned, to energy in the near future, for reasons which you've probably read about in the media. European countries are far too dependent on Russian energy. Australia is in the fortunate position of not being. Second, Russian attempts to avoid sanctions by transferring trade to third countries which don't have sanctions regimes could well prompt the Americans to begin imposing what they call secondary sanctions. These are sanctions which are directed towards people who are not just US citizens or residents, firms, but they are totally outside the US, and they may be doing business with a sanctioned entity which is entirely lawful under the local law and has nothing to do with US territory whatsoever. But the US says, well, if you're going to trade with sanctioned entities, you're not going to trade with us. And so if we find that you're doing it, we may ban you from US trading with US markets and ban you from the US financial system, or even possibly put you on the sanctions list yourself. So the fear of losing access to US markets and the financial system is a very powerful tool. And it's the reason why if you've ever tried to get a payment made from anybody on any international sanctions list through one of the large international banks, even if you've got approval from all relevant governments who are actually directly involved, whether in the UK, for example, EU, you'll find it practically impossible because the international banks simply don't want to take the risk. And that will almost certainly have been having a massive effect already on Russian business. So even before any sanctions actually bite on the big banks, for example, they will already have pulled away from doing that work. Thirdly, and finally, on sanctions, whatever sanctions are imposed, as I say, they're going to grow incrementally, at least towards services very shortly. They're likely to be enforced for the long run. The UK Foreign Secretary said last week to G7 foreign ministers that she thinks the sanctions should stay in place until Russian troops withdraw from Ukraine. That probably is a bit optimistic if you're Russian, because there's going to be little appetite, in my view anyway, to remove sanctions to any significant degree without a long-term negotiated peace between Russia and Ukraine, or the end of the Putin regime and his replacement with somebody far more acceptable to the West. And as neither of those things looks particularly likely in the near term, sanctions are here to stay. The second point and the third point, I'm going to descend from the macro level to the micro level and talk about how individual businesses are being affected or might be affected in the coming months. The first one is supply chain disruption. You may find you or your clients, if you're providing professional services, your clients may have had commercial dealings with Ukrainian businesses, or even the government, or Russian parties, and may now be finding that services or goods that were ordered have not arrived. And the law has something to say about what happens in this situation and what the effect of war should be. I'm going to focus on English law, but as I said, there are parallels with Australian and US law. The first point, obviously, is your contract may well say something about what the consequences should be. You'll often find that it will contain something that's frequently called a force majeure clause. And what that generally seeks to do, although there's no single form of force majeure clause, and you have to read each one individually, but what they generally seek to do is relieve a party from having to perform its obligations, so for example, deliver goods, if it cannot do so because of an event outside its control. And often these clauses will contain examples of what kind of events will count. And war is often there. Government legislation, for example, sanctions, is often there too. So that could mean that the party who can't perform doesn't have to. But a note of caution, the devil's in the detail. And these clauses can often have unforeseen loopholes. And it's not unknown, actually, for businesses, in our experience, who've made bad deals prior to this kind of event, trying to take advantage of that event and argue that they should be able to get themselves out of their contract because they see that as a useful excuse. So you have to scrutinize any claims quite carefully. If you haven't got a contract, which is unlikely, or if your contract doesn't have a force majeure clause, then English law does still have a doctrine which might help you, which is called frustration. For a contract to be frustrated by an event, which means it'll be treated as terminated, the event must occur after the formation of the contract, be so fundamental as to strike at the root of the contract and be entirely beyond what was contemplated by the parties when they entered the contract. It can't be due to the fault of either party, and it must render further performance impossible, illegal, or make it radically different to that which was contemplated by the parties when they entered into their contract. So those are some pretty stringent conditions, and it's actually quite rare in practice for those to be satisfied. But if they are, the contract is, under English law anyway, viewed as terminated. Other laws have different effects. Continental jurisdictions deal with things differently, for example, as does the UN Convention on the contracts for the international sale of goods. So the third point I'd like to mention is states causing losses to investments or breaching international investment law. You or your clients may well have made an investment in the territory of Ukraine or Russia, and you may now be wondering what's happened to your investment. It may have been totally destroyed. It may still be there, but have been damaged in value. Well, you are not necessarily without some form of remedy. And I hope none of this will be taken as insensitive, given the obviously humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place in Ukraine. But private parties, businesses, individuals are often affected by war, and it would not be just, in my view, if they're forced to bear all of the consequences of that if the state has breached its international obligations. So both Russia and Ukraine have entered into numerous bilateral investment treaties, including with the United Kingdom, for example. And in summary, these treaties say that each state promises the other state that if its investors come to it and invest in its territory, then it will protect those investors and their investments in certain ways which are specified in the treaty. And importantly, these treaties give investors the right to sue the host state of the investment for breach of those obligations, as usually done through in arbitration in a neutral forum by an independent and impartial panel. So it really does have teeth. And you don't necessarily have to have made a concrete physical investment in the territory of the host state to qualify. Perhaps that's the paradigmatic case. So you've opened a factory, for example, in Ukraine. But both the Russian and Ukrainian treaties contain broad definitions of investment, which would include, for example, claims to money under contracts. So if you do have an investment within the meaning of the treaty, then the treaties provide two main types of protection for your investment. First of all, if the state takes your investment or expropriates it, then it must pay appropriate compensation. Under international law, sovereign states are allowed to take your property, but they have to pay compensation. Secondly, the states must afford your investment and you, the investor, what's known as fair and equitable treatment, and also full protection and security. So if your contract is cancelled, for example, or your factory is taken by the state, you could well have a right to be compensated through investor-state arbitration. And if you win in the arbitration and the state still fails to pay, then you can take your arbitral award and with relative ease, provided you can find assets to enforce it against, you can take that around the world and enforce it, thanks to an international convention called the New York Convention on the Enforcement of Foreign Arbitral Awards, which actually makes it easier to enforce arbitration awards on the whole than it does court judgments. So what's the effect of war on this? Is that an excuse to take your property or breach these duties? Well, the answer is not necessarily. It isn't necessarily a defense for a state just to say, oh, well, we were at war and therefore we didn't have to do any of this. Those obligations continue anyway. And the UK-Ukraine treaty, for example, specifically provides for investors to be compensated if they suffer loss of their investments due to war in Ukraine, whether through requisitioning of property or through destruction by Ukrainian forces, otherwise than in combat, or which was in combat, but where the destruction was not necessary. For any other causes of loss to investments, you can still potentially recover compensation, provided you can show that the state failed in its duty of fair and equitable treatment or full protection and security. And those standards of care are, in very crude terms, a standard of what's known as due diligence, or perhaps you could say reasonable care. And it's a very fact-sensitive exercise in working out whether that was breached or not. And war being the chaotic phenomenon that it is, naturally claimants might struggle to prove exactly what's happened to their investments. Although they might actually find it easier in this war than in past wars, given the amount of videoing that's been done, reporting that's being done almost in real time. So that's all I have to say for now on those three topics. It's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully there's something there that's of interest to you. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions later in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, James. We're hoping that we're running a little bit over time, but we're hoping if people can stay on for a little bit longer, we can probably cover off the questions. And just to remind the audience to pop your questions into the Q&A on Zoom. Our next speaker is John Swerringer, Minister Counsellor Treasury, Australian High Commission, London. John is the Australian Treasury's Department's Senior Representative to Europe and the United Kingdom, covering economic and financial developments. In 2021, John managed the Health, Disability and Social Security branch at Treasury, working closely with other agencies on health policy through the coronavirus pandemic and on the development of income support payments to assist individuals through lockdowns. And prior to this, he managed Treasury's National Security Team and has worked with the Macroeconomic Modelling and Policy Division. John worked for the Reserve Bank of Australia, managing many aspects of Australia's foreign exchange reserves and open market operations, including management of the RBA's US Treasury portfolio in New York during the financial crisis. He has a PhD in finance from ANU and undergraduate degrees in economics and finance. Welcome, John.
Thanks so much, Joanne. And thank you to the Chamber as well as CPA Australia for today's event. In the interest of time, I'll try and be really quick. So what I thought I might do is just provide a little bit of discussion on the context in which we're operating and the current macroeconomic challenge, and then talk a little bit about the outlook, particularly with respect to energy prices, which is such an important driver of inflation at the moment. So one of the things about the current context that I think gets forgotten in some of the headlines, and what's going on in Russia and Ukraine is absolutely important, is that I think what we're experiencing at the moment is both strong aggregate demand as we come out of the coronavirus pandemic and the supply shock that's coming at the moment most acutely through energy prices and food prices from what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. So if I try and unpack those two things separately, the demand shock probably leads to higher growth and also higher inflation, whereas the supply shock should lead to lower growth, but also higher inflation. And so you put those two things together, and the one thing you get unequivocally is higher inflation. And depending on whether demand or supply is driving things at the margin in particular economies, the growth prospects are then a bit more clouded. So when we look at where we've come from, coming out of the pandemic, as most economies sort of revert towards their trend, they experience very strong short-term growth. So when I looked at the EU and the European Commission's forecast for the European economy for this year, up until their update this week, they were thinking that the European economy would expand by 4%, which is pretty strong by European standards. A lot of the support that's been given to households and businesses coming out of the pandemic is sitting on balance sheets still. Savings rates became very high. They've started to drop, but they still remain quite elevated by historical standards. So for the majority of households and a lot of businesses, their balance sheets are strong, even if high prices are starting to erode their consumption or their real incomes and squeeze their profit margins a little. So I guess, in that context, I'd probably just highlight, don't forget that we are entering this period, from a position of relative strength in some ways. When we look at what's going on the supply side of the economy, we were sort of rattled by a few supply shocks, coming into this episode. So, disruptions in supply chains have been going on for the last couple of years with, lockdowns in China and other places, making us sort of re-examine our resilience in our production processes and things. Energy is clearly driving inflation in Europe at the moment, and it's the biggest driver. In the UK, in their inflation update yesterday, energy inflation had jumped 54%. I mean, it's just incredible. The UK has a very peculiar set of arrangements whereby sort of household energy bills are sort of capped, and every 6 months that cap is rejigged, and so it sort of comes through with a lag in the UK. But nonetheless, in Europe, when it put out its inflation yesterday, energy prices were still rising about 27-28%. So energy is definitely a big driver of inflation at the moment. Food prices are also a big driver. But I guess in trying to unpick whether a particular economy has stronger demand or is suffering more from this supply shock, one way to try and unpick it is to look at core inflation, which sort of excludes volatile items like energy prices. In that respect, if you look at the UK, core inflation in the UK yesterday, came out at 6.2%. So headline inflation is 9, core is 6.2. There's clearly there's clearly a broader category of goods that are rising in price and services in the UK than just energy. And so that tells you that the demand picture is relatively strong. We can see that in the labour market. We've got unemployment at 3.7%. There are more job vacancies than there are unemployed people. And I think that's the first time ever in that particular series that's happened. So the economy is looking good. On the other hand, if you look at Europe, you've got headline inflation of about 7.4%, and you've got core inflation of about 3.5%. So core inflation is rising, but perhaps you could infer from that the supply shocks are probably dominating a little bit in Europe. And you see this in the difference in the monetary policy responses that you're getting. Now, this confluence of events is undoubtedly one of the biggest challenges for monetary policy authorities in recent years. We think that unconventional policy and quantitative easing and forward guidance have all been tricky. Well, trying to deliver rate rises in an environment where a lot of households have their real incomes going backwards, that's an incredibly challenging environment, and one where the communication challenge is very difficult. So I think on that basis, we've seen the Bank of England move preemptively and start to tighten rates over the last few months. And that probably does reflect that broader and stronger demand picture. The ECB, on the other hand, is, I think, coming around to it that actually some of those inflation pressures are broadening out, but has so far sort of, just stuck to their original plan of winding down their bond purchases and then thinking about whether they raise rates later in the year. They may yet move a bit quicker, but we'll have to see. The main thing that I think both central banks are watching quite closely is wages. We want wages to rise. We want them to rise with productivity. But if they chase inflation and create that reinforcing dynamic of wages chasing prices and then, re-embedding in higher prices, then central banks are going to act more aggressively. And the risk will be that they will drive, the economy here into recession. And so that's a key risk. When we look at the outlook, I guess, the main risks are, I guess, on the demand side, that high inflation in some circumstances can kill high inflation, because as households experience that real income shock, they lower their consumption, and that should lead to a slightly weaker picture for aggregate demand and the economy. On the supply side, clearly the risks remain around food and energy prices. If we do get to a situation where there are abrupt sort of changes in energy supply to Europe, we could expect that energy prices will take another leg higher, and that will then feed back into inflation again. It's incredibly hard to say what the prospects of that are. When we look at things like the variety of forecasts that have been put out about the German economy, which is heavily dependent on Russian gas, as to what the economic impacts would be, you get a range of outcomes that from reputable sources that say it could be a hit to the economy of anywhere between 2 and 12%. The ECB on Monday, the European Commission on Monday put out its spring forecast. And in that, they did a couple of pieces of scenario analysis. The main one was a severe shock to energy supply. And their sort of thinking is that will knock 2 percentage points off GDP, 2.5% percentage points off GDP growth, which would effectively, take their forecast back to close to zero for this year. So, further energy sanctions or the cut-off of supply unilaterally by the Russian side certainly puts the European economy at risk. In some ways, though, I think when I talked to my colleagues at the European Commission, and we spoke to them in Brussels last week, one thing I took away is just how engaged they are in continuing to drive forward that sanctions agenda. That they see that the position they are in, where the EU is effectively paying almost €1 billion a week to Russia for energy, is just it's indefensible in the current environment. And so they are moving as quickly as they can to reduce reliance on Russia, to push countries to come together behind sanctions. And obviously that's difficult with 27 member states. But the one thing I take away from my meetings with my counterparts is that they will continue to push for further sanctions to reduce and eliminate that dependence on Russia for energy, because they know that they can't stand behind that equation. €1 billion a week, to Russia, where on the other side of it, so far, the EU has contributed $2 billion in aid to Ukraine. And so I think those two things are playing on their minds, and that's the direction of travel for them. So in the interest of time, I'll probably finish up there, and we can jump to questions.
Thank you, John, for that excellent economic analysis. So I'm opening up the floor for questions. I do have a question from the audience. And I think maybe John or the High Commissioner might answer that, but anybody else can jump in. And the question is, in an era of increased political tension, how should we protect free trade, global cooperation, and seamless travel?
So I think that's a great question. Trade is in a way about trust. And at the moment, we are sort of reevaluating the level of trust that we have in certain partners. I don't think that it's changed our attitudes to free trade in broad. And you can see that in the great enthusiasm we have for the free trade agreement that we're about to sort of have ratified with the UK. But it does mean that we are increasingly thinking about our reliance on partners with whom we have questions about trustworthiness. And I can't see that going away for a long time. The geopolitical circumstances, seem like they're here for quite a while.
And just to add to that, I think it's vitally important that we continue to press ahead and maintain an open and free trading system, such as through the Australia-UK FTA or other FTAs that we're negotiating at the moment, and maintain that confidence in open systems. Because once everybody regresses into borders and restrictions, it's actually a downward cycle. So I think it's important that we defend free trade.
Thank you. Theo, have you got any comments on that question? No,
thank you.
Oh, okay. Right. What are Russia's likely long-term prospects for its economy now that the West is weaning itself off Russian hydrocarbons? Will the surplus oil and gas all be purchased by other non-Western countries, or has Russia shot itself in the foot, economically speaking?
So maybe I'll start with that one, but that's the $1 million question, if you like, or perhaps it's the $7 billion question. It depends exactly on whether sanctions come in on Russian oil and gas from Europe. It depends how forceful they are and how quickly they come in. A lot of Russia's infrastructure, just as EU countries are dependent, particularly Central and Eastern European countries are dependent on Russia for gas and oil. Russia is equally dependent on supplying it. There is pipeline infrastructure that can't be rerouted. Everyone's got their refineries set up, certain grades of crude oil and other things. But equally, if Russia can't keep pumping that stuff out, they can't store it necessarily either. And so, there's every reason to think that if sanctions come into effect quickly, that they will be quite debilitating to the Russian economy. It might even ruin some of their current capability. And if you look at particularly the UK sanctions, which are really, and the European ones to a great extent, they're really about, exports of the material that's used to keep refineries working and operating and that infrastructure operating. So in the sort of medium term, there's going to be, deterioration in their capability in that respect anyway. So the prospects for the Russian economy look miserable for quite a while. Inflation is obviously high at the moment, and capital flight has been a risk, and they've sort of jacked up interest rates to try and prevent that. But their problems are only just starting. And I think, as other people have said, it's hard to see a scenario in which these sanctions are unwound anytime soon. And so as long as that remains the case, we're going to see a slow deterioration of their infrastructure and their capability.
Thanks, John. Would anybody else like to comment on that or jump on? No? Okay. Many expected Putin to lean heavily on China for economic and moral comfort during his invasion of Ukraine. To what extent has China been forthcoming in providing economic and diplomatic aid to Russia?
I think that's the million-dollar question, really. I think the 4th of February meeting between Putin and Xi just ahead of the Winter Olympics and their declaration of a no-limits friendship caught everybody's attention, and we've all been interested, somewhat also concerned, obviously, to see the extent to which that partnership strengthens and that China backs in Russia's actions. This is a short response to what could be a very long answer, but I think China itself is mindful of the consequences. It was taken aback by Russia's unilateral action, and I think it's watching closely the unity of the international response. I was interested yesterday to see a report that China itself, some of its exports to Russia have slowed down dramatically, for example, in the export of laptops to Russia, because they contain components which are manufactured either in the United States or using US software or manufacturing equipment. Goes to the point that was made earlier about the extraterritoriality of US sanctions. And I think they're weighing very carefully the consequences. And diplomatically, we're also pointing out that a unified international response by everybody is very important so that Russia feels the cost of its actions.
Thank you. Thank you. And just on that point, this is one for you, Theo. Australia's relationship with China has changed dramatically over the past decade, both economically and politically. Considering your learnings, what lessons might there be for Australia to take away from the most recent conflict between Russia and Ukraine? And yes, what are those lessons?
Yeah, I mean, I think the lessons are around the importance of having alliance structures that you can operationalize in a time of war, and if that's necessary. I mean, one of the reasons, and being prepared for that, and that includes obviously, of course, in terms of partners in the region, supporting those partners to develop their own defense capabilities. So the critical thing here is NATO's ability to provide the institutional structure that enabled European and the United States, European countries to channel military aid to Ukraine has been critical. The EU, of course, has been a critical institutional structure in galvanizing action with respect to financial sanctions. But also, very importantly, the military assistance that was provided by UK, Poland, and the United States to the Ukrainian self-defense forces in preparing for this invasion. Those are all been really important. And I think what's different in the Asian context is there are, of course, various structures for military cooperation here, but you don't have the depth of institutionalized military cooperation that you have within NATO. And of course, you don't have the Article 5 guarantee. And so that's quite significant. So I think in this context, as much as the AUKUS deal, between Australia and the US and the UK may or may not result in nuclear-powered attack submarines, what it has done, however, is further deepen Australian ties with the United States and the UK. And I think that actually is probably going to be very important as they cooperate, both to develop the next generation of military technologies, but also as we continue to cooperate with those partners in preparing for, the prospect, unfortunately, of some form of conventional warfare in this part of the world in the future.
Excellent, thank you. We are now out of time. So I'd just like to thank all our speakers, the High Commissioner, Theo Farrell, James Hayton, Colleen, and John Swerringer. Thank you so much from the Chamber of Commerce in the UK, and we wish you a wonderful day. Thank you.